Okay, so nice to have you again, Manreet. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you, and thank you for joining us at an early hour from where you are. And we completely believe the cat part. We still need to see the daughter.
Thank you, Suki. No, it's my pleasure actually to be able to join. And the cat, as you know, as the world knows, cats have their own way. You cannot control them. But believe me, I think daughters are a step ahead. So
Lovely. So thank you for joining. And, obviously, the first question, because we had you speak with us earlier about one of your books on in the trilogy, and now we have all three of them here. So, from Lahore to Hyderabad to Kashmir, tell us first why the trilogy.
okay. So it's an interesting question, Suki, and I have to admit that I get asked a lot the same question, especially by people who either are Bengalis themselves or have an interest in Bengali history because they are peeved that I have not added Bengal to this part of what they feel should be a quad, a set of 4 books. And there is a definite reason for why the Partition Trilogy has only Lahore, Hyderabad, and Kashmir. Sorry, the reason being that I'm looking at places where in the aftermath of partition and in the events leading up to it, the violence happened very suddenly. Literally in the case of Lahore, where I'm looking at the months leading up to partition until September of 1947. And the case of Lahore and Hyderabad and Kashmir, it was still 1 year after independence and partition. The violence in all 3 cases was cataclysmic. It happened very suddenly, the rupture and the migration of people, both east and west, or in and out of Hyderabad or in and out of Kashmir. Whereas in the case of Bengal, the transfer of people east to west continued pretty much until what we call the 1971 War of Independence for Bangladesh, which is when sort of the fence came up and people stopped relocating. So I wanted to look at these particular places because I come from a small town on the border between India and Pakistan. It's called Firozpur. And I grew up with stories of partition, not only in my own home, but in sort of the larger sort of town that I come from. The curious thing about Firozpur is that at the time of India's partition, it was a Muslim majority town. So by the laws of partition, it should have gone to Pakistan, but it didn't. And that was something which, always fascinated me because, that is something that people talked about openly. And the reason for that is that Firozpur has always been a important military garrison from the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So at the time of partition, it was a very large cantonment town, which meant that there was a large arsenal of ammunition. And it is still speculation because nothing has really been written about, but that Pandit Nehru nudged Mountbatten, who sort of nudged Cyril Radcliffe. And if you look at the Radcliffe line, there is a squiggle which forms around Firozpur, and then the line speeds in a northeasterly direction. So, but what that ended up doing was that it made me a writer because my adolescence then coincided with what is called the Sikh militancy, which in many ways people in the hometown certainly said, "Ita santali wapas aa gaya." It is 47 all over again. But I went on like a good student to do engineering and then went to business school and worked in Bombay actually for 9 years. I had a corporate career. It is only when I moved out of India that in a strange turn of events, I felt that the stories of my homeland, which I had been running from, needed me to reckon with them. And that started my journey at the turn of the millennium to researching and learning and finding out more about partition, why it had happened and where are those stories, because I'm sure this is probably true for all Indians, but I didn't find those stories in my history textbooks. I also did not find them really in literature. There is some fabulous literature dealing with partition, but I think it's very scarce, especially when we, let's say, compare it with the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, where, I live in New York City, and every year there are these fabulous books that come out, memoir, literary fiction, graphic novels, all kinds of literature, which is tussling with that event. And my question used to be, why do we not have stories? What happened to what is considered the largest migration in modern human history? The estimate is 12 to 15 million people went east or west, and 2 to 5 million lost their lives. So why are we not recording their stories? In fact, where are those stories? So that started my journey in 2000, as I said, at the turn of the millennium. And I started the project with doing oral archives in my own hometown. So, because I remember we were in Singapore at that time, and I mentioned this to my husband, and he said, well, why don't you start speaking with your family? And that's where my project started. And as we all know, these are very painful memories. There is a lot of trauma attached to them. And the first response from everybody was like, you're an engineer MBA. Why do you want to talk about these things? Just do your job. But I guess I'm a good Punjabi. I stuck with it. And slowly the archive increased. I started talking to the extended family, to people in our colony, to people at large in the hometown. And my sort of understanding of partition as it grew, so did the fact that there is such scarce availability of those resources also, in terms of recorded testimonies of these people. So to cut a long story short, when I was researching what I thought was Punjab and the story of Punjab, I came across how the laws of partition, for instance, most people nowadays assume when you look at the map of India that this is the map that the British left us, which is not true at all. What the British did was they said at the time of partition, there was British ruled India, which was directly ruled by the British colonial empire. And then there were the princely states, which had a viceroy. They were nominally independent, and they reported into the viceroy, who, at each of these places, who then reported into the overall British Empire. And we had 565 princely states. So just to make illustrate it, around 300 of those were what is present-day state of Gujarat. Saurashtra, for instance, literally means 100 rashtra's or 100 fiefdoms. So a lot of them were really very small states, more like fiefdoms. But if we had not sort of incorporated those princely states within what we consider now the territory of India, and by the British laws, they could accede to India, they could accede to Pakistan, or they could choose to be independent. Now, let's go with the assumption that these 565 princely states are choosing to be independent. So today, if I want to go from Bombay to Ahmedabad, I would probably need to stop my car for a visa check every 10 kilometers down the line. So this was the situation that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the Home Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister of the interim government, was looking at. And he realized very quickly that he and his team needed to incorporate these princely states, most of whom were Hindu majority, into the fabric of India, because after 15th August 1947, we are really looking at, as one of the political leaders described as, this is like a mutton curry, we have pieces of mutton within the fabric of what would be the curry of India. And so they set about, with his very able Secretary of State, VP Menon, to incorporate these princely states into India. And really what it meant was talking to them, negotiating, getting them to sign what is called the Instrument of Accession. Now, on 15th August 1947, there were 3 princely states which had still not acceded to either of India or Pakistan. 2 were the largest princely states. One was Hyderabad, the other was Kashmir. Hyderabad is not a sort of Hyderabad city or the broad area of Hyderabad as we know now. The princely state of Hyderabad incorporated obviously Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, large parts of Karnataka, and large parts of Maharashtra. So it was geographically a very large state, also the one with the largest population, whereas Jammu and Kashmir, again, which had Leh, Ladakh, and Gilgit-Baltistan, which is now in what we call Western Pakistan, were very large states. And then we had Junagadh, which was a small princely state. And the matter of Junagadh actually gets resolved quickly enough, and I cover it in book 2 of the Partition Trilogy, Hyderabad. However, as I said, when I was researching, I realized that Well, Kashmir is something which is very topical and everybody seems to have a view on it. The story of Hyderabad had been completely forgotten. And I knew it at a very personal level because my husband is a Kannadiga. I am married into a South Indian family. And I remember very early on, my in-laws told me that, no, in the South India, we don't have a partition story. It is so, our amnesia as Indians is so strong about how the princely state of Hyderabad was forced to accede to India, because what we finally did was what we copied our colonial masters and we rolled our tanks into Hyderabad and declared a war upon our own people and got them to accede to us. So these stories were fascinating, and I thought that I needed to incorporate them within my larger project of the Partition Trilogy, where I was looking, as I said, at cataclysmic events unfolding at a very rapid pace. And this was the time, if there is any young people in our audience, I want them to know that there was no Google or internet or cell phones that you were getting information. Information was maybe coming 45 days, 2 months behind, after it had been taken in the corridors of power in Delhi or London. And therefore, people on ground had no idea. Their lives were being changed significantly, substantially. They were told they were no longer, their home was no longer their home, and they had to flee with whatever they could sort of carry in their hands, rupturing families, rupturing friendships and love and affection. And so that was the theme which ties these three books together.
So, what is beautiful about your books is that while there is this deep research that you talk about, there is an overlay of, with these historical events, there is an overlay of some personalized fiction in your book, and which is so beautifully done, because that's, those stories have not come out, like you said, and I may have heard from my grandparents and you heard from yours, but those are not out there in the open. So how did you so both tell us about both these things? Research, you told us a little bit, tell us a little bit more, and tell us about how you put these personal stories together. And then I'm going to come and ask you about characters who jump from one book to the other after that.
Sure. Um, so so yeah, as I said, I had no training in literature. I'm not even a literature student. As I said, I was an electronics engineer, and then I went to business school in IIM Calcutta. And then I sold, as I say, sabun tel with Hindustan Lever. And then I worked in consulting and advertising. So when I was kind of struck by a thunderbolt that I had to do this, I was in Singapore, and I started going to the Singapore National Library. Singapore has an extensive and amazing library network. I started sort of going through their archives to sort of, I was coming as a newbie, as a complete novice, to build my own understanding of why things had happened the way they had happened. So my research was progressing in two parallel strands. One was the strand of trying to understand what our political leaders were doing, why they were doing what they were doing, what were the dilemmas and the challenges that they were facing at the time of, in the run up to partition and thereafter. And the other was actually speaking to people on the ground. As I said, my first point of access was my own hometown, to speak to people on the ground and understand their stories. What had happened? How did they get to know? Who were their family who were left behind, or which part of the family had come over, or who had completely overhauled their lives? These were very difficult conversations, the second part, because anybody who deals with people who have lived with trauma knows that the way people deal with trauma is to stop talking about it, to stop engaging with it. It is, if people, and remember the imperative at that time for people who had been uprooted was to basically rebuild lives. So you have to look forward, not backwards. There was also a lot of trauma in terms of the abduction and kidnapping of women. And we're talking about a culture where, the honor of the family, in fact, entire lineages seems to be tied with a woman. We're talking about trauma which surfaces in terms of, we now have terms for them, PTSD, depression. But I remember growing up in Firozpur, in the colony, in the lane behind us, there was what we used to call a mad woman. It's only much, much later when I became a mother myself, when I started this project, I realized that she was not mad, that she had actually been abducted when the family was trying to flee. And then Pandit Nehru and even on the Pakistani side, the leaders decided that they needed to bring their women back. In fact, in India, the term used was that we have to be like Ram and bring our Sitas back, which was a very noble initiative. But what it ended up doing was that a lot of these women had actually married the men with whom they had been abducted or whom they had found themselves with. They had children with them. And now they were forcibly plucked out of those households and brought back. And obviously, remembering the equation of the honor of the family is tied to the women were told to just seal their lips and not speak about it. In which case, you're just internalizing the trauma. You're putting a lid on it, but it shows up. And that was the story of the mad woman, for instance, in my colony. So I was building this archive of my own without having any sense of how I would make sense of it. Forget making sense of it in a fictional way, in a novel, where there are certain imperatives for that art to work. So I continued this journey. We moved from Singapore to Hong Kong, another place with an excellent library network. For instance, that's the first time I encountered, since I was interested, I had realized by that time that my project would have two sort of threads. One would be what I was calling internally the Delhi thread, where the political leaders are taking decisions. And the other would be the Aam Aadmi and Aurat thread. And I was very clear that the Aurat had to be there because the women had gone missing in the interstices of history. So in the political leader thread, Jawaharlal Nehru, as we are aware, wrote a lot. He was very erudite. He wrote a lot. He wrote during his long prison terms. Discovery of India was entirely written then without the help of Google or whatever, entirely from the mind. And he has something called the Selected Works of Jawaharlal Nehru, SWJN, and it runs, I think, up to 99 volumes. And the Hong Kong Public Library had those, and I had access to them, and that's when I started reading those. In the case of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, research was a little difficult because Sardar Patel was an orator. He was a people of the masses. He was not a writer. So getting an access to his thoughts, what was going on with him, proved far more challenging. And then, of course, I figured that the third person who needed to be in the Delhi thread had to be Dicky Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, who then stayed on as the first Governor General of India. And Dicky Mountbatten, again, there is, because the British, as we know, are excellent record keepers. So there was a lot of material available on Dicky as well. But again, in all these cases, I was interested in the women. What about Edwina Mountbatten? Edwina did such sterling job with refugees, with people who had fled in the refugee camps, and we never talk about it. Similarly, Maniben Patel, who was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel's certainly daughter, his assistant, his record keeper, his homemaker, the woman who would knit warm clothes for him, who took care of his health, who gave him his medicine on time, uh, and really his memoirist and diarist. So we never talk about Maniben. She's always in the shadows. So I was very interested as I was researching these sort of hallowed political figures to also look at the women who are helping them achieve what they did. So this was a very long process. As I said, I started the turn of the millennium and I was struggling. This was 2014. I was writing other books. I had no idea how, if ever, I would make sense of all this research that was piling up that I had. And then I think, Shah Rukh Khan says this beautifully in a film that, and I'm paraphrasing here, then when you want something from the universe, when you really desire it, in a kainat se milta hai aapko. That kind of happened with me because my husband's work moved us to New York City. And when I moved here, I realized that I had an opportunity to enroll in an MFA program, which is a Master's in Fine Arts in Creative Writing and Literature. As I said, I'm not a literature student. I had written 4 books by then, published 4 books, but I felt one that I needed to be with people who were like-minded. Because all my friends were engineers and business school people, and when I would meet them, they would say, "Acha, agla kitab kab aa raha hai? Haan, agla kitab." And I would be like, they don't roll off a factory floor, It's a very different process. But to cut a long story short, I joined City College because they have a very flexible program. And the other thing I like about their program is that half of the credits are for English literature courses, in their case, also American literature. And I wanted to study literature like a student. I wanted those tools which come from analyzing a piece of writing as a student of literature. So I did that, and I did half the credits in creative writing. It was a 2.5-year program. I did it over 5 years because I was also writing on the side. And then, as luck would have it, I came across a professor called Sadia Hartman, who is now with Columbia University. And she has come up with this concept called critical fabulation. And really what it does is that on a skeleton of hard research, so your scaffolding of your project has to be very hard research. And then on top of that, you do a padding of imagination. So it's like flesh upon the skeleton. And for me, it was like light, because that's what I thought. I had the material for that. I could do that. Because I did not want to write about Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel and Dickie Mountbatten as sort of these hallowed figures, figures whom we encounter as people trapped in paintings or posters on our walls or these statues. I wanted to see them as flesh and blood characters. So when a reader reads it, they should be in the head of Jawahar, they should be in the head of Vallabh, they should be in the head of Dickie. And then, therefore, to be able to write, say, if I'm in all the books, as I said, in the Delhi thread, my protagonist is Jawahar. He's not Jawaharlal Nehru, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, he's Jawahar. So if I'm writing about Jawahar, I need to know who he is. For instance, when he gets up in the morning, what is the first thing he does? He used to do a headstand. That was the first thing he did every morning. What does he like to drink? Is it tea, coffee, or he doesn't like caffeine at all? Does he smoke? If he smokes, what is the brand of cigarettes he smokes? Because I have to make him a real character for people to really appreciate and understand. And by this time, I was also at a stage where it is now advanced because we're 10 years ahead. History had begun to be weaponized worldwide. People have started claiming, in India, of course, we have WhatsApp University as well, but people have started claiming, certain truths. Apparently, we live in a post-truth world. So I was very clear that I was going to work on a series of novels where I was presenting these individual stories of Lahore, which is set in the run-up to partition, and then Hyderabad and Kashmir, which are actually happening at the same time. So our leaders are tackling with these two very complicated, very thorny, very diverse set of problems at the same time. But since the human mind, certainly a person who wants to read a piece of fiction and immerse themselves in that, is not going to be able to deal with these, I separate them into two separate novels. So we have Hyderabad and Kashmir. And in all of these, as I say, the Delhi thread is a common thread. And then I have the Aam Aadmi in order to show how the decisions which are being taken in Delhi, how are they impacting the people on the ground? Now, just to sort of finish this very long-winded answer, when my publisher and I sat down and he said, okay, so you have protagonists called Jawahar and Vallabh and Dickie. In India, we still have sedition laws, which date back to the British Empire, which means anybody can get up and say, hey, I read Manreet's book and my sentiment was offended. So, here I go to the police station. So which means, to cut a long story short, each of my manuscripts went through the publisher's legal team. The lawyers had to ratify them. They had to sign it off before it went to the printer. And if anybody has had the fortune or misfortune to work with lawyers, beware, because the manuscript goes to the lawyers. They don't care that I'm a writer and this is the approach I have. They are like, on page this, you say this, please give us proof, evidence. And then, so first line of argument is, look, I'm not a typist. I don't copy paste. I read, let's say, 5, 6, 7 sources, and then I draw upon an understanding, and this is my understanding. And they're saying, we're fine with that. Just give us those 5, 6 sources. So wow. Literally for every book, there were 150 to 200 evidentiary pieces needed. Each of those pieces had 4, 5, 6, if I was lucky, maybe 2 pieces behind them. And because these are lawyers, they need proof in the sense that I sit in New York, so I have to take a picture, and then I'm doing the kind of rigor that is involved with the most rigorous of narrative non-fiction or non-fiction pieces you see, where, either it's in the footnotes or behind. So you don't see it in my novels, but they sit in these thick files at my publisher's office. But what I was doing was I had to take a picture of all those evidentiary pieces. So let's say clarification 1.1 they have raised, do all that. This is from this book published then by this publisher, page this is. So if I can say the trauma that I have from dealing with lawyers is far more than the trauma I had from talking to people about partition. But that's the essential work which needed to be done. And that is the work which has gone in all of these books. And I and my publisher decided we needed to have a select bibliography, which is there at the end of each of these books. It is select because I have read many, many multiples of those books to get to the final data and information that I needed. So yes, that is the process which has gone into writing these books.
And who inspired the characters who are the fictional characters? Did you find any stories that are, or there a combination of stories that you found? Any particular story that comes to mind, especially with context to Kashmir?
Yeah, see, in all these stories, most of the characters, fictional characters, are actually composite characters from real life. There are so many. I mean, 12 to 15 million people. We're talking about, we could, we live in an age of franchise cinema, right? Hollywood is doing these franchise. We could do a franchise on Partition and never end. There are so many stories, heartbreaking stories, but also stories of love and friendship and affection and joy. And I saw it in my own family. My Tayaji, my father's elder brother, was studying in Lahore, FC College Lahore. He was finally a master's in English and sciences, at that time, which was quite an achievement. But he and his friend wrote to each other almost every second day. There were letters coming back and forth. That friend visited with his grandchildren to Firozpur. So my sister, when she went across, she met that family. So what I'm trying to say is that, of course, there is a lot of trauma, there is a lot of pain and loss and suffering, but there is also love and friendships. And I wanted to bring both these facets alive in the stories that I'm telling. Now, for the case purposes of dramatic sort of, intent, which any piece of literature, fictional, requires, I needed to make them composite characters because I needed to make the characters in that span of time, give them that agency, give them that drive, make the stories pop. But there are many characters who are true. So for instance, in Kashmir, I have a character called Zuni. Now, Zuni is based on a character whose even real name we are not entirely clear about. She's either called in the sparse literature that I found around her, she either called Zoon Gujri or Zuni Gujjar. But you will find she was a sharpshooter. She was a Gujjar woman, who are originally shepherds. And she was a sharpshooter because when the Kabylis reached almost the doorstep of Srinagar Valley, um, Sheikh Abdullah and his people raised a volunteer army. And we know what the Kabylis did, the amount of havoc that they wreaked on property, on people, and especially women. And Salamati Forge, which was a self-defense force, was built up from the ground. Women were encouraged to come out of their houses and learn to use a stick, for instance. And the women who were unafraid and who were bolder were taught to use rifles. And Zuni Gujjar turned out to be an excellent sharpshooter. In fact, you will come across pictures of her where Sheikh Abdullah is, there has been a march past, and Sheikh Abdullah is introducing Jawaharlal Nehru to the Salamati Forge women, and Zuni is there. She's being introduced as this excellent markswoman. So, but beyond that, I don't have too much information on Zuni. And in Kashmir, I actually want to flesh out Zuni because, as I said earlier, that a lot of narrative around independence, around partition, is about nation building, about the idea of looking forward, which is all great. But we forget that there is a price we paid for all that, which is partition. And partition stories disproportionately are the stories of women, of their suffering, of their loss, of the incredibly tough choices that they had to make to keep their family, to keep their children alive. And we don't have those stories. So my agenda with these novels was also to bring the stories of women front and center, to sort of bring them out of the interstices. And Zuni was a fascinating character, and I have used as the padding of my imagination on the scaffolding that I have of her to show what Zuni could have done. Now, we don't know whether she did it, but in my mind, she is perfectly capable of doing it. So I set her on that journey in Kashmir.
But that's a beautiful thought that you have there. Especially the fact that the women's stories are so little told. And it's a remarkable thing to pick those up and to narrate them. But tell us first a little bit about how is the Kashmir story different from the others? There is something to that tumult that continued, obviously, for the political, and the reasons of how it was structured. But tell us a little bit more about what you found in your research.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think, as I said earlier, Kashmir is one issue where every Indian has a viewpoint. And very often, when you start engaging with people, you realize that the viewpoint is entirely or largely speculation. It is an issue which we internally, as people, don't debate. We don't talk about it. We have just made some common assumptions about how Kashmir should be, how Kashmiris should be, without delving into what the situation was like and what is the journey, what is the arc that has brought us to time t equal to now. And that was my intent with Kashmir 1947, to say, hey, maybe you want to read this and sort of do a time travel and start from there and then take the journey forward. So, for instance, in the case of Kashmir, it is very commonly assumed that the troubles in Kashmir started with the Kabilis, which is a misnomer, which is actually not true. The troubles in Kashmir had been brewing for a very long period of time. So, just in terms of some data, for instance, Kashmir was 85% Muslim. It was a Muslim majority princely state ruled by a Hindu Raja, Maharaja Hari Singh's family. Jammu and Kashmir was a very diverse state. So Jammu, for instance, had a slight Hindu majority, or maybe 50-50. We had the valley, which was predominantly Muslim majority. We had Ladakh, which was arid, sparsely populated, but largely Buddhist. We had Gilgit-Baltistan, which was again Muslim majority, but the kind of Islam practices was very different. It was Shia Islam, more Sufi, mystic, tribal kind of practice of Islam. So Hari Singh was very aware of this. Hari Singh was aware that the princely state that he was ruling was diverse. It was also a state which could not be kept together with, sort of the winds of independence and partition blowing, sort of be kept together by force anymore. Because, we have to remember that Hari Singh in Kashmir and the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was in a sense the flip, it was Hyderabad was a Hindu majority princely state ruled by a Muslim Nizam. Both these people were aware that it would be very difficult, with the waves of democracy coming, blowing their way, for them to be able to continue ruling the way they had. But they also had a vision that they could be independent, that they could have a Switzerland-like neutrality, which was invoked certainly by Maharaja Hari Singh. He saw his princely state of Jammu and Kashmir as being kind of the neutral Himalayan state between India and Pakistan, the erstwhile brothers. He had all these notions. But Hari Singh was also out of touch with ground reality. Because on the ground, Sheikh Abdullah and the people, his followers, had been asking for azadi, for at least 15 years. Sheikh Abdullah and Maharaja Hari Singh's response had to be just jail Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah had served some 9 years in prison over 3 consecutive terms. So there was a huge sort of conflict, a gulf between what the people on the ground wanted and what the monarch, Hari Singh, was dreaming of. So there was this dichotomy. And then by the laws of partition, as the British had laid out, the Muslim majority states would go to Pakistan, and the Hindu majority would stay with India. So by that uh, sort of estimation, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir should go to Pakistan, and that was broadly how it was understood on both sides. Vallabhbhai Patel, in fact, has given statements, and these are recorded, where he said he absolutely saw Kashmir going to Pakistan. However, Jinnah was a little greedy, I could say. He was very interested that Hyderabad finds some way of allying itself with the new nation state of Pakistan. And one of the reasons is that Pakistan was born, but it had no money. And the Nizam of Hyderabad was the wealthiest man in the world. He had been featured on the cover of Time magazine twice. He was, as I like to say, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk combined on steroids. He was that wealthy. And a pauper state needs money. So Jinnah was very keen to ally Hyderabad with Pakistan, the new nation state of Pakistan. So some of that money, some of the coffers of the Nizam could go in building up the nation state of Pakistan. So Jinnah had these backdoor conversations happening with Hyderabad. And for that, readers, you have to read Hyderabad. I cannot go into that here. So I will just leave a point. So for instance, it was Jinnah's man who was the prime minister in the Nizam's court. He was a member of the Muslim League. And Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru were completely aghast at this sort of backdoor negotiations that were happening, because the broad understanding was that Hyderabad goes to India and Kashmir goes to Pakistan. And we also have to remember that Hyderabad was, as Vallabhbhai Patel said, is in the belly of India. And if, the Nizam, we lose Hyderabad, that's like a cancer which will forever grow in the belly of India. So with that as a backdrop, there is, and with the chaos of partition, it seemed at a point in September and early October 1947 that the new state of India would collapse. There are newspapers, and people can go look them up in the archives, which are already talking about how the new independent nation state of India is going to collapse because riots and refugees have taken over the capital city of Delhi, and which was true. There was rioting happening. There were refugees who had to be settled, who had to be placed in camps. Food had to be arranged, water had to be arranged, and passions were running high. So our leaders were already engaged with that. Jinnah was getting impatient because Jinnah was not being denied Kashmir by Delhi. Jinnah was being denied Kashmir by Maharaja Hari Singh. Jinnah was making overtures to Hari Singh, and Hari Singh was like, no, he was playing, he was like, no. Maharaja Hari Singh would go off on these vacations and not be available. So he'd gone on a hunting expedition or whatever. And then Jinnah makes the fateful decision of nudging Hari Singh by sending the Kabilis in. When the Kabilis come in, these are frontier tribesmen who have been promised that the loot of Srinagar awaits you. And if you read Kashmir, I open with that, what they have been promised, the bounty of Kashmir. And these are hardened tribesmen. We don't know them now as Afghans, and we know what Afghanistan has been going through. They are natural mountain fighters. They have a natural ability. They're skilled at fighting from mountaintops. So when they start coming in and wreaking havoc, Hari Singh's army cannot stand up to them. Hari Singh very quickly realizes that he is going to lose entire Kashmir, and not just lose Kashmir, because the Kabilis are at the doorstep of Srinagar Valley, and they're going to reach maybe his palace, and then they will wreak the same fate that they have been doing to others. So that is when, Hari Singh sends an urgent telegram with his prime minister begging India to come to its help. And the rest is to be read. It's in the book and it unfolds. But as I said, the trouble in Kashmir did not begin with the Kabilis. In fact, in April of 1947, Hari Singh unleashed even more demonic taxation on the locals. So if a person had more than one wife, and they will be taxed, the second wife or third wife would be taxed. If they had X number of sheep and then they had more sheep, they would be taxed for that. At the same time, the Punchis, who are who live in Poonch, which is now in what
Yeah.
we call Pakistan occupied Kashmir or independent Kashmir, whichever side wants to talk about it. The Poonchis were considered a martial race. Now, this is just a branding that the British love to give, like they gave to the Punjabis, they gave to the Muslims, that these are martial people. The Poonchis were considered martial people. Why that is important to our narrative is that the Poonchis, these martial people, like the Sikhs in Punjab, had gone to fight the world wars and had come back. They had been demobilized, they still had their weapons on them. And the Poonchis were in revolt against Maharaja Hari Singh's taxation policy. So in April of 1947, they are sending telegrams to Jinnah saying, come help us. We don't want to be with Hari Singh. Hari Singh is wreaking havoc on us. We want to be part of Pakistan. So if you have to really start tracing where the trouble, that is a flashpoint. When Jinnah says, okay, so I can have some play here. So that's when, if you really have to start tracing, a flashpoint in 1947, that's when it begins. And then the story continues.
And of course, like you said, we need to see the rest of the story in your very interesting book with these beautiful women characters that you have brought. I'm so glad that you've done that because, like you said, there are so many small stories of sacrifices and the accommodation made by these women for these large scale sort of panoramas that have played out that we know at least something about through our history. I wish some of these stories were also. So, I have a question for you. How do these stories get into our textbooks? How do our children see our history through this mirror, through this lens, rather through the very, very drab history books that we read? You have some thoughts on that?
I do. That's why I've written the Partition Trilogy. Read the books. And I'm being very serious here, and I'll tell you how. So I remember when my publisher and I had this conversation, we were very clear that, we know in India books that sell a lot, you find pirated copies. In Bombay, especially, we know where to go to pick up those copies, right? One book which surfaces over and over and probably one of the largest selling books, even on Amazon, is Dominic Lapierre and Larry Collins' Freedom at Midnight.
Yeah.
Now, it's a book all of us have grown up reading. And I wrote the Partition Trilogy as a counterpoint to Freedom at Midnight. And here's why. Freedom at Midnight is a white person's account of what independence, partition, and 15th August 1947 was all about. It is written by two white writers, and a large amount of their research comes from speaking directly to Dickie Mountbatten 25 years after the event has happened. Dickie Mountbatten is human after all, and every human being who has been involved in such a momentous event has a tendency to conflate their own role in it. So when I see Indians reading Freedom at Midnight and taking it to be the Holy Grail equivalent, I feel this is our story. This is our story. We need to seize our story. We need to tell our story with our own point of view, with our own observations, and which is why I have written the Partition Trilogy. As I said, it is based off very rigorous research, both in the Aam Aadmi and Aurat thread, in the Delhi thread. This is, the Delhi thread is like narrative nonfiction. You can read it like a narrative nonfiction book, and then it provides, and I'm trying to humanize and bring alive flesh and blood characters, even our political leaders, because there is so much that goes around in this post-truth world, speculation, idle speculation, like, oh, if Vallabhbhai Patel had been the prime minister, then we would, which is all tosh. Anybody who has any amount of understanding of how partition happened, how India reached 15th August and what we did afterwards, would know that Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel, as Bapu said, Gandhi said, they were a pair of oxen that he had tied to the bullet cart of India. Anybody who has any sense of how farmers work with oxen in the field will know they can only move in a united direction. They cannot go separate ways. And that's why I would urge people to go pick up the Partition Trilogy if you really want to know your history, because I do understand that our current history textbooks, partition has been reduced to a paragraph, I believe.
Yep. Any illustrated books for children in your mind to make some of these stories come even more alive for them?
I would love to, Sukhi. That's a great idea. I mean, we'll see how these things unfold going forward.
Lovely. I do hope that lots of people pick up your books. I have the first two, but I still need to get Kashmir, and I'm really looking forward to that book reaching me. I'm going to take you through some of the questions here. Jyoti, of course, loved your cat, whom she saw right in the beginning.
I will let
And of course, and of course, everyone has great admiration for just the mammoth research that you have undertaken, and especially as you've explained the, sort of the legal approvals that you require for that. So Milind and Kailash have both complimented you on that. Milind says that regarding the comment of rolling out our tanks on our own people, the ruler of Hyderabad state Nizam and the Razakars did not consider themselves as part of India, like you said. And Nizam had wanted to be independent and was being wooed by Jinnah. So he's sort of restated what you mentioned. Razakars and Hyderabad's armies had armed themselves to defend against India. So was the Indian government acting against its own people, really? So, which is what it
So
was.
you have to read Hyderabad for that. The story is never as simple as it seems. There is a
Mm.
reason I have written these books. So please, if there's the Razakar, there was the Hindu Mahasabha, there was there is never. If it is just one force, then life would be very easy. They're always competing forces for attention, for power, for supremacy. And Hyderabad is not a simple story at all.
Kailash says, what an extensive research. I'm sure a lot of these are captured in the book, but the amount that you haven't included yet would also be significant. And would you make that available in some form, in some journals, or and so on?
Maybe you join the legal team at my publisher.
But I think the sense that I'm getting is that people are asking you, are more books in the offing which deal with a similar subject, or are you now done with the trilogy and you're going to move on to something else entirely?
That is a very good question, Suki, and I have one answer. I have reached it. I have been involved with what I call the Partition Project, because even before the Partition Trilogy, I have written The Radiance of a Thousand Suns,
Right.
which looks at 1947 and 1984, what in India we call the 84 riots. They are not riots. A riot assumes premeditated violence, violence on both sides. It is a pogrom. In the Sikh community, it's also called genocide. And before that, I have written The Long Walk Home. So it is a subject that I have been tussling with for a quarter century now. And now that I have written the Partition Trilogy, in fact, last December we launched it at the Bangalore Literature Festival, and I was going home to Firozpur, where I go every year. My mother still lives there in our house. And I was going to go there, and I told my husband and my daughter, and they did an eye roll because I think it's very dramatic. It's a very Bollywood sentiment, but it was very true. It was very true to me. And I told them I'm going to take all my three books to the Satluj because the Satluj is very easy to access from our house. Of course, there is barbed wire, and then there are fields, and then you see what is called Pakistan on the other side. And I told my family that I'm going to take my three books to the Satluj, and I'm going to say, look, mitti da kar zyada ho gaya. I have done what I needed to do, and I really need to move on. Because the thing with writing stories of trauma is that you internalize that trauma. It doesn't go away. It becomes a part of you as well. And I
True.
think I'm ready to sort of, as I said, I very carefully took that burden off, metaphorically, and let it go in the river. So I would not want to return to partition again. The books are out there. They are for people to read, to engage with. But I think I'm going to move on.
I can sense that burden sitting. I mean, I'm sure it's like 1,000 stories and a million opinions that you've dealt with. Um, Milind wants to know your political views on holding a plebiscite in the entire Kashmir, including Pakistan, occupied Kashmir now, and to still let the people decide. And why does India object to that?
I don't know if, I mean, honestly, I always tell people I have researched 1947. That's where sort of my real skills lies.
Mm.
But I don't know if it's a political viewpoint. I don't know if plebiscite is the way to go. I'm not a person who's well versed with these thoughts, but I do feel that the fate of the Kashmir is for the Kashmiris to decide. It is not for the rest of India to assume, uh, what Kashmir is or is about. We very often in India forget that we are more a federation of people. We are a very diverse set of people. We are an equivalent of an EU, but even more complex and diverse than that. Just in terms of the languages, the culture, the food, everything about us is diverse. We are a union of states, which means every state, it's a federal structure. And it is not for us to assume that we can decide what the Kashmiris want. Of course, over 77 years, so much has happened, that we need to bring the Kashmiris into the fold and say, what do you want? How do we solve this? This is not for us to do a top-down approach and tell people this is the way we see things are right and this is what we should do. I mean, Kashmir, if I remember the dates correctly, till 64 or 65 had its own constitution. It had its own flag. When I tell this to people, people are astounded. They don't even know about it. So maybe what the rest of India needs to do is to educate ourselves about Kashmir, about whom we claim ये हमारे भाई बहन हैं. तो आप अपने भाई बहन को कितना जानते हैं? What do you know about them? Um, Kashmir is not a tourist spot. It's not a place to go and sort of, have a lovely holiday on a shikara, which absolutely we should be doing. But Kashmir is for the Kashmiris, and they have to decide what is right for them.
True. Milind says, of course, that he loves your statement that this is our story and we need to tell it. And maybe there'll be, 1,000 other people like you who will narrate different aspects of these stories. Not enough has been said. Bhupinder Bali says that just finished reading Kashmir and found it very interesting. How much fiction is in this? And is the Kashmir depicted in the book the actual Kashmir?
I don't know what you mean by that, really. Are you talking about the beauty of Kashmir? I went to sources. A lot of my description of Kashmir from that time is by sources who wrote about Kashmir around that time. I have had Kashmiris tell me that I have managed to capture the beauty of Kashmir. So, well, that is my hope. I mean, I do. The novel is not set just in the valley. I have Muzaffarabad. I have a small place which is now where one of the large refugee camps was, where I have tried to describe the situation of those camps, there is no beauty involved there. One of the features of those camps was that vultures would circle overhead all the time because corpses, dead bodies were just strewn in the fields. But yes, I have tried to capture the Kashmir of that time period, both this sort of majestic, splendid beauty and the great horror that was visited upon it.
Yes, and the stories of women, as I think I've said a few times, we are all familiar with some of them that we've heard from our families, but lots more stories are probably still sitting there, and they're probably dying with some of the people as our population has aged and moved on. So, not to, this is a good time to be capturing whatever else is there because the generational trauma will otherwise sort of be upon us throughout. Anyway, on that note of uh, the the delight at how you brought forward this book and that you have paid your dues to your soil and to your waters, and what a remarkable job you've done with that, with the characters, both real and fictional, that you've created and presented to us. I hope people do pick up your books and read, and I hope you keep writing, whether it is about but not about partition, but about other aspects, and keep sharing them with us. And we hope to have you back here on our program, and sharing further. Thank you very much, Manreet, for joining us again. And thank you very much to our audience for joining us every Saturday and today. And see you again on the 20th. Next week, we are taking a break. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, Suki. Thank you, Team KHAKI. And thank you, everybody, for joining and for your questions. I mean, I just want to leave us with one thought. Um, Ashish Nandi, who is one of India's foremost sociologists and has actually done a lot of work on partition, he has a very interesting quote, and I want to leave people with that because I think it's a thought and it's something we need to think about. And he says that in all these conversations that we have in the subcontinent, whether it's India, Pakistan, or with Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, the dead are uninvited ghosts at every gathering. And I think we need to remember that because that explains maybe why there is so much violence in our midst, certainly violence that we commit within our own families, violence against women, that helps us understand that we have to reckon with this. And the only way to reckon with it is by engaging with stories, by opening up to those stories. So thank you,
Thank you
and
so
have
much.
a lovely weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for that thought.